There exists a theater of human interaction where masks are worn not upon the face, but upon the soul itself. In this grand performance, some are players and others are merely played, puppets dancing to strings they cannot see, moved by hands they do not recognize. The question that should pierce your consciousness like a blade through silk is not whether you have been manipulated, but rather how deeply the strings have already been woven into the fabric of your choices, your beliefs, your very identity. Machiavelli understood what most refuse to acknowledge, that the world is divided not between the moral and immoral, but between those who recognize the games being played and those who remain blissfully, dangerously unaware. Every conversation you enter, every relationship you nurture, every decision you believe to be your own, carries within it the potential for invisible influence. And the frightening truth is that the most effective manipulation is the kind you never detect, the kind that makes you believe your cage is actually freedom. Consider for a moment the unsettling possibility that your strongest convictions may not be yours at all, that they were planted in the garden of your mind by skilled cultivators who understood the seasons of human psychology better than you understand yourself. The great Florentine observer of human nature recognized that power flows not to those who possess superior morality, but to those who possess superior understanding of how human beings can be moved, shaped, and directed. We live in an age where manipulation has evolved from crude coercion into an art form so refined that its victims often defend their manipulators with genuine passion, believing themselves to be acting from authentic desire when they are merely responding to carefully orchestrated stimuli. The merchant who makes you feel inadequate so you will purchase his remedy, the politician who stokes your fears so you will embrace his protection, the friend who subtly positions themselves as your savior while slowly making you dependent on their validation. All these understand what Machiavelli taught, that human beings are far more predictable than they wish to believe, and that this predictability is the foundation upon which all manipulation is built. Yet there exists a fortress of the mind, a citadel of self-possession that renders such manipulation impotent. And Machiavelli himself illuminated the architecture of this defense through his unflinching examination of power dynamics and human nature. This fortress is not built from ignorance or naivety, for those are the weakest materials, crumbling at the first siege of a skilled manipulator. Rather, it is constructed from something far more formidable, a clear-eyed recognition of how influence operates, a disciplined mastery over one's own reactions, and a sovereign sense of self that bows to no external validation. The traits that create this immunity to manipulation are not virtues in the conventional sense. They do not make you beloved or celebrated, but they make you unconquerable. And in a world where everyone seeks to bend others to their will, being unconquerable is worth more than being liked. These traits are both armor and weapon, protecting you from those who would use you while allowing you to navigate the treacherous waters of human interaction with clarity and purpose. The path to such immunity begins with a recognition that may disturb you, that you have been trained since childhood to be manipulable, that every institution and relationship has, to some degree, sought to make you responsive to external control rather than internal authority. Machiavelli would not flinch from this truth. He would embrace it as the necessary first step toward liberation. Your education taught you to seek approval from authority. Your social conditioning taught you to fear rejection. Your culture taught you to measure your worth by external metrics. And all of this, whether intentional or not, created the perfect conditions for manipulation to flourish. The manipulator relies upon your need for acceptance, your fear of conflict, your desire to be seen as good, your tendency to doubt your own perceptions when challenged. They rely upon the fact that you were never taught to distinguish between genuine connection and strategic positioning, between authentic concern and calculated performance. But once you understand the game, once you recognize the patterns, you gain the power to opt out entirely. What follows is not a collection of simple tricks or superficial advice, but a deep excavation into the specific traits that Machiavelli's observations reveal as the true foundations of immunity to manipulation. These are characteristics that transform you from a potential victim into someone who cannot be moved against their will, someone who sees through the performances others stage, someone who maintains their center even when storms of persuasion rage around them. In examining these traits through the lens of Machiavellian wisdom, you will confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about society, and perhaps most importantly, about yourself. You will discover why certain people seem immune to the tactics that ensnare others, why some navigate political intrigue and social manipulation with ease, while others are constantly exploited. This is not about becoming manipulative yourself, though understanding these principles will certainly reveal how manipulation operates. It is about becoming sovereign, about reclaiming the throne of your own consciousness from those who would occupy it without your permission. The first and most crucial trait that renders you immune to manipulation is what Machiavelli would recognize as the capacity for unflinching observation of reality as it is, rather than as you wish it to be, or as others insist it should appear. This trait separates those who can be easily controlled from those who stand on solid ground. For the manipulator's greatest weapon is their ability to construct a false reality that serves their purposes, and your greatest defense is your refusal to accept any reality that contradicts what your clear observation reveals. When someone tells you that your memory is faulty, that your perceptions are wrong, that your feelings are invalid, they are not correcting you. They are attempting to destabilize your grip on reality itself, creating the psychological vertigo that makes you grasp for their version of truth, as a drowning person grasps for any floating debris. The person who cannot be manipulated is the one who trusts their own observations more than another's interpretations, who recognizes that the map someone else draws of territory is always designed to serve the mapmaker's interests, not necessarily to represent the terrain accurately. Machiavelli understood that princes who survived were those who saw their kingdoms not through the flattering reports of courtiers, but through direct, unromantic observation of actual conditions, actual loyalties, actual threats. In your own life, this same principle applies with devastating effectiveness. The manipulator depends upon your willingness to accept their framing of situations, their characterizations of events, their definitions of what is reasonable or unreasonable, normal or abnormal, generous or selfish. When you possess the trait of reality testing, when you consistently compare what people say against what they do, when you notice the gap between proclaimed intentions and actual outcomes, you become nearly impossible to deceive for any extended period. This is not cynicism, despite what those who benefit from your credulity might claim. It is simply the refusal to surrender your own perceptive faculties to someone else's narrative control. The person who observes that a supposed friend consistently undermines them in subtle ways, who notices that a partner's apologies never lead to changed behavior, who recognizes that an authority figure's concern for their well-being somehow always results in them sacrificing more, while the authority sacrifices nothing. Such a person cannot be gaslit, cannot be convinced that exploitation is actually care. This trait requires practice and courage because you have been trained to doubt your own perceptions, especially when they conflict with what authority figures or loved ones tell you is true. The manipulator knows this and will often respond to your accurate observations with indignation, hurt feelings, or accusations that you are suspicious, untrusting, or damaged. They will tell you that your observation of their pattern is actually your own psychological problem, that your memory of their promises is selective, that your experience of their behavior is misinterpretation. But the person who possesses true immunity to manipulation has developed what Machiavelli would call the virtue of seeing things as they are rather than as they ought to be. And this virtue acts as an impenetrable shield against such tactics. You begin to notice that when someone's explanation of their behavior requires you to disbelieve your own clear observations and memories, the problem lies not with your perception, but with their dishonesty. You recognize that reality has a consistency to it that false narratives lack, that truth tends to align with observable patterns, while lies require constant adjustment and revision to maintain their coherence. The development of this trait transforms your entire relationship with information and influence. You stop accepting claims at face value and instead evaluate them against observable evidence. You notice when someone's story changes in subtle ways, when details that should be memorable are conveniently forgotten, when timelines shift to suit current needs rather than reflecting actual chronology. Machiavelli observed that effective rulers maintained networks of information that bypassed official channels, ensuring they received unfiltered reports rather than politically motivated distortions. And you must become your own intelligence network, gathering data from your own observations rather than relying solely on what others choose to tell you. This means paying attention to what makes you uncomfortable, to those small inconsistencies you are tempted to excuse or explain away, to the pattern that emerges when you step back from individual incidents and see the larger picture. The manipulator fears nothing more than someone who keeps records, who remembers, who compares current claims to past statements, because such a person cannot be convinced that history is whatever the manipulator currently needs it to be. Moreover, this trait of unflinching observation extends to observing your own reactions and vulnerabilities with equal clarity. Machiavelli knew that self-knowledge was a form of power, that a prince who understood his own weaknesses could compensate for them, while one who remained blind to them would inevitably be exploited through them. You must cultivate the same ruthless self-awareness, recognizing which emotional buttons can be pushed to make you compliant, which fears can be activated to make you malleable, which desires can be leveraged to make you useful to others' agendas. When you know, for instance, that your need for approval makes you susceptible to withdrawal of affection as a control tactic, you can observe that need without being controlled by it, recognizing when someone is deliberately triggering it for their own purposes. When you understand that your fear of conflict makes you likely to concede in arguments, not because you are wrong, but because you cannot tolerate tension, you can compensate by deliberately tolerating that discomfort rather than capitulating to end it. Self-observation becomes self-protection. The cultivation of this trait also requires that you abandon the comfortable fiction that most people are fundamentally honest and have your best interests at heart. This does not mean becoming paranoid or assuming universal malevolence, but it does mean recognizing what Machiavelli understood, that every person acts primarily according to their own interests, and that these interests will sometimes align with yours and sometimes conflict with yours, and that it is your responsibility to discern which situation you are in at any given moment. The person who insists on believing that everyone means well, that misunderstandings are always innocent, that betrayals are always anomalies, is the person who provides manipulators with an endlessly renewable resource to exploit. In contrast, the person who observes behavior without the distorting lens of wishful thinking, who accepts that some people are indeed willing to harm others for their own benefit, who recognizes that trust must be earned through consistent action rather than granted through naive assumption. Such a person builds their defenses on stone rather than sand. Reality becomes your ally rather than your enemy. For when you see clearly what is actually happening, you can respond effectively rather than being blindsided by unpleasant truths you refuse to acknowledge. This first trait, then, is the foundation upon which all other immunity to manipulation is built. The disciplined practice of observing reality without the comforting distortions of hope, social conditioning, or emotional need. It is the trait Machiavelli himself exemplified in his writing, the unflinching willingness to describe human behavior as it manifests rather than as moral philosophy insists it should manifest. When you possess this trait, you become a poor target for manipulation because the manipulator's primary tool, the construction of a false reality that serves their purposes, finds no purchase in your mind. You have learned to trust your own eyes, your own memory, your own analysis. And while you remain open to new information and alternative perspectives, you no longer allow others to convince you that your direct experience is somehow invalid. In developing this capacity for clear observation, you take the first and most essential step toward becoming someone who cannot be manipulated, for you have reclaimed the most fundamental territory that manipulators seek to occupy, your own perception of what is real. The second trait that creates immunity to manipulation is what Machiavelli would recognize as emotional sovereignty. The capacity to experience your feelings without being enslaved by them, to acknowledge emotional responses while refusing to let those responses dictate your decisions or make you vulnerable to those who would exploit them. This trait distinguishes between those who can be controlled through emotional triggering and those who maintain their agency, even in the midst of powerful feeling. The manipulator's toolkit is largely composed of emotional levers: guilt, fear, shame, hope, desire, and they pull these levers with the expectation that your behavior will automatically follow your emotional state. That if they can make you feel guilty enough, you will comply. If they can make you fearful enough, you will submit. If they can make you hopeful enough, you will invest in their schemes. But the person who possesses emotional sovereignty responds differently. They feel the guilt or fear or hope fully, acknowledge it, examine it, and then decide consciously whether the action the emotion prompts is actually in their best interest or merely in the interest of the person who triggered the emotion. Machiavelli observed that successful leaders could not afford to be governed by emotional reactions, that to respond to insult with automatic retaliation or to perceived threat with panic was to surrender control of one's actions to others. The same principle applies to your personal life with equal force. When someone accuses you of being selfish for maintaining a boundary, they are attempting to weaponize your shame and guilt, banking on the fact that these emotions will override your rational assessment of whether the boundary is actually reasonable and necessary. When someone threatens you with abandonment or rejection if you do not comply with their demands, they are wielding your fear of loss as a weapon, expecting that the emotion will compel you to submit rather than risk the relationship. When someone offers you an opportunity that seems too good to refuse, but requires you to act immediately without reflection, they are manipulating your hope and excitement, knowing that these emotions cloud judgment and accelerate commitment. The emotionally sovereign person experiences all these feelings but does not mistake them for commands. They recognize emotions as information about their internal state, not as dictates about their required behavior. The development of emotional sovereignty begins with the radical practice of allowing yourself to feel uncomfortable emotions without immediately acting to make them go away. This is counterintuitive because you have been conditioned to view emotional discomfort as something that must be resolved immediately, and manipulators exploit this conditioning relentlessly. They create emotional discomfort through accusation, withdrawal, anger, or disappointment, then position themselves as the solution to that discomfort, offering relief if you will only do what they want. But when you can sit with guilt without needing to prove you are not guilty, when you can tolerate someone's anger without needing to appease them, when you can endure rejection without compromising your boundaries to prevent it, you remove the manipulator's primary leverage. Machiavelli would recognize this as a form of fortitude, not the fortitude of enduring physical hardship, but the perhaps more difficult fortitude of enduring emotional discomfort while maintaining your chosen course of action. The person who will sacrifice their own needs, values, or well-being to avoid feeling guilty or anxious or disapproved of is a person who can be controlled by anyone willing to trigger those feelings. This trait also involves recognizing the difference between emotions that arise from your own authentic experience and emotions that have been deliberately induced by external manipulation. Your own grief at a genuine loss is real and deserves your attention and respect. The guilt triggered by someone who consistently violates your boundaries and then accuses you of being hurtful when you protest is not authentic guilt, but rather a manufactured emotional response designed to maintain their control. Machiavelli understood that princes must distinguish between real threats and manufactured ones, between genuine loyalty and performed allegiance, and you must develop the same discriminating capacity with your emotions. When you feel terrible after every interaction with a particular person, when your anxiety spikes in response to their communications, when you find yourself constantly trying to prove you are not the selfish, unreasonable, or damaged person they suggest you are, these emotional responses are not random. They are the result of systematic emotional manipulation. The emotionally sovereign person recognizes these patterns and understands that the solution is not to try harder to please the manipulator, but rather to recognize the manipulation itself and withdraw from the dynamic. Furthermore, emotional sovereignty requires that you abandon the belief that your emotions are other people's responsibility or that other people's emotions are your responsibility. This belief is the foundation of most emotional manipulation. The manipulator will present their anger, sadness, or disappointment as something you caused and therefore something you must fix, ideally by doing exactly what they want. They will treat your emotions as inconvenient obstacles to be dismissed or weapons to be used against you, rather than valid experiences deserving of respect. But Machiavelli recognized that each person is ultimately responsible for their own state and their own responses, that while we may influence each other, we do not control each other's internal experiences. When you accept this truth, you stop believing that you are responsible for managing everyone else's emotional state, and you stop accepting responsibility for emotional reactions that are actually choices the other person is making. The person who claims they had no choice but to yell because you made them angry is lying. They chose to yell, and your refusal to accept responsibility for their choice is essential to maintaining your sovereignty. Similarly, when you feel angry or hurt, you recognize that while these feelings are real and valid, they do not justify violating others or demanding that they rearrange their lives to accommodate your emotional state. The cultivation of emotional sovereignty also involves developing what Machiavelli might call emotional cunning, the ability to strategically reveal or conceal your emotional responses based on what serves your interests, rather than being an open book that anyone can read and exploit. The manipulator relies on your emotional transparency, your tendency to show exactly what you feel so they can calibrate their manipulation accordingly. When they see that a particular tactic creates visible anxiety or guilt, they know to employ that tactic more frequently. When they observe that withdrawal of affection causes you visible distress, they learn that they can control you through strategic coldness. But when you develop the capacity to experience emotions without necessarily displaying them, to feel angry without showing anger, to feel hurt without revealing vulnerability, you deny the manipulator the feedback they need to refine their tactics. This is not about being dishonest about your feelings, but rather about recognizing that not every feeling requires external expression, that you can process emotions internally without making them available for others to exploit. Machiavelli advised princes to maintain composure even in crisis, to deny enemies the satisfaction and tactical advantage of knowing they had created fear or uncertainty. And this same principle protects you from those who would use your emotional transparency against you. This second trait of emotional sovereignty transforms you from someone who can be herded through emotional manipulation into someone who moves according to their own deliberate choices, even when feeling powerful emotions. You recognize that feelings are temporary states that provide information but do not constitute commands. That guilt may inform you that you have violated your own values, but does not mean you have done anything wrong. That fear may alert you to potential danger, but does not require you to surrender to others' control. In developing this capacity to experience emotions without being controlled by them, to acknowledge feelings while maintaining agency over your actions, you close the second major avenue through which manipulators operate. You have learned that emotional reactions are not the same as truth, that someone's anger at your boundary does not mean the boundary is wrong, that your discomfort with someone's disapproval does not obligate you to change your behavior. Emotional sovereignty, combined with clear observation of reality, creates a fortress that manipulation struggles to penetrate. For you can neither be deceived about what is happening nor compelled through emotional coercion to accept what you have clearly observed to be exploitation. The third trait that renders you immune to manipulation is what Machiavelli would identify as the cultivation of independent judgment. The capacity to form your own conclusions based on evidence and reason, rather than accepting the interpretations, opinions, and evaluations that others provide for you. This trait is essential because the manipulator's strategy often involves controlling not just what you see, but how you interpret what you see. Not just what happens, but what it means. They cannot always control events, but they work diligently to control the narrative around events, to establish themselves as the authoritative interpreter of reality whose explanations you should accept without question. The person who possesses independent judgment refuses this outsourcing of their cognitive function, insisting instead on drawing their own conclusions, even when those conclusions are unpopular, inconvenient, or socially uncomfortable. Machiavelli himself demonstrated this trait in his willingness to analyze power dynamics without regard for whether his conclusions aligned with prevailing moral orthodoxies. And this same intellectual independence is required if you are to remain unmanipulated in a world of competing narratives designed to serve others' interests. The development of independent judgment begins with recognizing that most of what you believe was not arrived at through your own analysis, but rather absorbed from authority figures, cultural conditioning, and social consensus. This is not inherently problematic, as we cannot personally investigate every truth claim we encounter, but it becomes dangerous when you have not developed the capacity to question and revise these inherited beliefs when evidence suggests they may be wrong. The manipulator relies on your tendency to defer to authority, to accept that experts or leaders or more confident individuals must know better than you do, and they position themselves as such authorities to discourage your independent analysis. When you develop true independent judgment, you may still consult experts and consider others' perspectives, but you insist on understanding the reasoning behind their conclusions rather than simply accepting their authority as sufficient justification. You ask questions like, why is this true? How do you know this? What evidence supports this conclusion? What alternative explanations might exist? And you evaluate the quality of the answers rather than simply accepting that someone's status or confidence makes their claims valid. Machiavelli observed that princes who relied entirely on advisors' interpretations without developing their own analytical capacity were vulnerable to being manipulated by those advisors, who could frame situations to serve their own interests while claiming to serve the prince. In your own life, you face the same vulnerability whenever you accept someone else's characterization of situations without examining the underlying reality yourself. When someone tells you that your reasonable request is actually unreasonable, that your boundary is actually controlling, that your observation of their pattern is actually your own paranoia, they are attempting to substitute their judgment for yours. And if you accept this substitution, you surrender your ability to protect yourself. The person with independent judgment responds differently. They consider whether the explanation makes sense, whether it aligns with observable evidence, whether it is consistent with previous explanations, or represents a convenient revision. And they trust their own analytical capacity to reach valid conclusions, even when those conclusions conflict with what they are being told. This trait requires that you develop confidence in your own reasoning abilities, which means being willing to make judgments even in the absence of complete certainty, and being willing to revise those judgments when new evidence emerges. The manipulator often exploits people's discomfort with uncertainty, presenting themselves as the source of certainty, and positioning your own doubts as evidence that you should defer to them. But Machiavelli understood that uncertainty is the natural condition of human knowledge, that even the best information is incomplete, and that waiting for perfect certainty before acting is a form of paralysis that enemies can exploit. You must learn to make the best judgments possible with available information while remaining open to revising those judgments, which is entirely different from refusing to make judgments at all, and instead accepting whatever judgment others offer. The person who says, "I do not know what the truth is, so I will trust what this authority figure tells me," has surrendered their judgment. While the person who says, "I do not know what the truth is with certainty, but based on available evidence and my own analysis, this seems most likely," maintains their intellectual sovereignty. The cultivation of independent judgment also involves recognizing and resisting social proof as a manipulative tactic. The manipulator will often try to isolate your perspective, suggesting that everyone else sees things their way, and that your differing perception is evidence of your own dysfunction rather than evidence of their manipulation. They will invoke the opinions of mutual friends, family members, colleagues, or even strangers to suggest that consensus has formed against your interpretation. And if everyone else agrees with me, surely you must be wrong. But Machiavelli observed that popular opinion is often wrong, that the crowd is easily swayed by appearances and rarely examines situations with rigor, and that truth is not determined by vote. The person with independent judgment recognizes that being the only one who sees something does not mean you are wrong, especially when you have clear evidence for your perception and others have based their judgments on incomplete or manipulated information. You learn to trust your own analysis even when it is socially isolating to do so, understanding that the comfort of agreement is worth far less than the security of accurate perception. Moreover, independent judgment requires that you examine your own thinking for the biases and blind spots that manipulators exploit. Machiavelli was ruthlessly honest about human nature's predictable weaknesses, and this same honesty must be applied to yourself. You must recognize, for instance, that you have a tendency toward confirmation bias, seeing evidence that supports what you already believe while dismissing evidence that contradicts it, and manipulators will feed you information that confirms your preferred narrative while concealing information that would challenge it. You must acknowledge your tendency toward optimistic assessment of people you like and pessimistic assessment of people you dislike, and manipulators will leverage your affection or pre-existing trust to get away with behavior you would immediately recognize as problematic from someone else. By understanding your own cognitive weaknesses, you can compensate for them, deliberately seeking out contradictory evidence, testing your conclusions against skeptical questioning, and recognizing when your judgment might be clouded by emotional investment or wishful thinking. The development of this trait transforms you into someone whose conclusions cannot be dictated by others' framing. Someone who insists on thinking through situations independently, even when social pressure or authority demands compliance with a particular interpretation. You recognize that accepting someone else's judgment wholesale is a form of surrender, that every time you defer to another's analysis without conducting your own, you practice the habit of intellectual submission that makes you vulnerable to manipulation. This does not mean arrogantly dismissing all input or refusing to learn from others' expertise, but it does mean maintaining ultimate responsibility for your own conclusions, understanding that no one cares about the accuracy of your beliefs as much as you should, and that those who discourage your independent thinking typically do so because independent thought would threaten their ability to control you. In cultivating this capacity for independent judgment, combined with clear observation and emotional sovereignty, you create a third layer of protection against manipulation, for you can neither be deceived about what is happening nor emotionally coerced into accepting it, nor convinced through authoritative assertion that your own analysis is somehow invalid. You have become someone who thinks for themselves, and this makes you remarkably difficult to manipulate. The fourth trait that creates immunity to manipulation is what Machiavelli would describe as the strategic cultivation of detachment. The capacity to maintain psychological distance from outcomes, relationships, and investments such that you can walk away from situations that do not serve you rather than clinging to them out of fear of loss. This trait is crucial because the manipulator's power over you is directly proportional to how much you need what they control, whether that is approval, access, resources, connection, or validation. When you are desperately attached to a particular outcome or relationship, when you have convinced yourself that you cannot survive or thrive without it, you have given whoever controls that thing enormous leverage over you, and they can extract compliance, sacrifice, and submission by threatening its withdrawal. But the person who cultivates strategic detachment understands what Machiavelli observed, that necessity makes you vulnerable, while having alternatives makes you powerful, that the prince who has only one ally can be controlled by that ally, while the prince who has multiple options can negotiate from strength. The development of strategic detachment does not mean becoming emotionally cold or refusing to care about anything, which would be both psychologically unhealthy and strategically counterproductive. Rather, it means maintaining a clear awareness that everything in life is conditional and temporary, that relationships can end, that jobs can be lost, that investments can fail, and that your well-being cannot depend on any single external factor remaining constant. Machiavelli advised princes never to become so dependent on fortune or any particular ally that they would be destroyed by a change in circumstances. And this same wisdom applies to your personal life. When you recognize that you will survive the loss of any particular relationship, opportunity, or possession, you remove the leverage that manipulators use to control you. The person who threatens to leave unless you comply with their demands has power over you only if you believe you cannot thrive without them. But when you know with certainty that you will be fine either way, their threat loses its coercive force and becomes simply information about their character and priorities. This trait requires that you actively invest in creating options and alternatives rather than putting all your resources into a single basket. The person who has only one friend, one job prospect, one source of validation, one avenue for achieving their goals, is extraordinarily vulnerable to manipulation by whoever controls that single resource. But when you deliberately cultivate multiple friendships, multiple professional skills, multiple sources of self-worth, multiple paths toward your objectives, you create the abundance mindset that makes threats of scarcity less effective. Machiavelli understood that diversification of alliances and resources was a form of security, preventing any single actor from gaining the power to dictate terms, and you must apply this same principle to your own life. This does not mean being disloyal or uncommitted to relationships and endeavors that are working well, but it does mean maintaining the capacity to exit situations that become exploitative, abusive, or simply no longer mutually beneficial. The manipulator fears nothing more than the person who can walk away, because without the ability to trap you through your dependencies, their entire strategy collapses. The cultivation of strategic detachment also involves recognizing and dissolving the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in failing situations because you have already invested so much that abandoning the endeavor feels like waste. Manipulators exploit this tendency mercilessly, knowing that once you have invested significant time, emotion, money, or reputation into something, you become increasingly resistant to acknowledging that the investment was a mistake and cutting your losses. They may encourage you to make larger and larger commitments, knowing that each commitment makes you less likely to leave even as the situation deteriorates. But Machiavelli observed that wise leaders recognized when a strategy was failing and changed course, rather than stubbornly pursuing failure because they had already committed resources to it. You must develop this same ruthless pragmatism about your own investments, understanding that resources already spent are gone, regardless of what you do next, and that the only relevant question is whether continuing to invest serves your future interests. The relationship that consumed 10 years of your life does not become worth continuing simply because you have already invested those years. If it has become toxic or one-sided, leaving is not wasting the investment, but rather refusing to waste future years. Moreover, strategic detachment requires that you maintain a clear sense of your own identity and worth, independent of any particular role, relationship, or achievement. The manipulator will often try to conflate your identity with what they provide, suggesting that without them you are nothing, that your worth derives from your association with them, that your identity is defined by the role you play in their life. This is a devastating form of manipulation because it makes leaving feel like self-destruction, as if by walking away from the relationship or situation, you would be walking away from yourself. But Machiavelli recognized that leaders who defined themselves entirely by their position were destroyed when they lost that position, while those who maintained a core sense of self beyond any particular role could survive dramatic changes in fortune. You must cultivate this same internal stability, understanding that you are not your job, your relationship, your achievements, or your reputation, but rather a consciousness that exists independently of all these external trappings. When you know who you are, regardless of what you have or what roles you occupy, no one can manipulate you by threatening to take those things away. The practice of strategic detachment also involves regularly confronting your fears about loss and discovering that you are more resilient than you have been led to believe. The manipulator's threats work because you have convinced yourself that certain losses would be catastrophic, that you could not survive rejection, abandonment, financial setback, or social disapproval. But when you intentionally expose yourself to smaller versions of these feared outcomes and discover that you do indeed survive them, that life continues and even improves, you immunize yourself against manipulation through threat. Machiavelli observed that soldiers who had experienced battle and survived became harder to frighten than those whose fear was purely imaginative. And the same principle applies to psychological resilience. When you have actually experienced being disapproved of and discovered it was tolerable, when you have been rejected and found you could build new connections, when you have lost something you thought you needed and learned you could thrive without it, the manipulator's threats about these outcomes lose their power. You gain the confidence that comes from tested resilience rather than the brittleness that comes from carefully avoiding all discomfort. This fourth trait of strategic detachment transforms you from someone who can be controlled through their dependencies and attachments into someone who engages with life from a position of sufficiency rather than desperation. You recognize that while you may prefer certain outcomes and value certain relationships, your well-being is not hostage to any particular external factor, and this recognition makes you nearly impossible to coerce. When the manipulator threatens loss, you can evaluate whether the cost of compliance exceeds the cost of what you would lose, and you can make this evaluation clearly rather than from a place of panic about survival. In developing this capacity for strategic detachment, combined with clear observation, emotional sovereignty, and independent judgment, you create a defense that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. You cannot be deceived about what is happening, emotionally coerced into accepting it, intellectually convinced your perceptions are wrong, or threatened into compliance through fear of loss. You have become someone who operates from choice rather than compulsion. And this freedom is the foundation of true immunity to manipulation. The fifth trait that renders you immune to manipulation is what Machiavelli would recognize as the disciplined mastery of your own impulses and immediate desires, the capacity to delay gratification, resist temptation, and make decisions based on long-term strategic thinking rather than short-term emotional satisfaction. This trait is essential because manipulation frequently operates by offering you something you want right now in exchange for something more valuable that you want later. And if you cannot resist the immediate gratification, you will repeatedly make trades that serve the manipulator's interests rather than your own. Machiavelli observed that leaders who could not control their appetites, whether for pleasure, revenge, or validation, were easily manipulated by those who could provide or withhold the objects of their desire. And this same vulnerability exists in anyone who lacks self-discipline. The person who must have what they want immediately, who cannot tolerate delay or denial of their impulses, is a person who can be controlled by anyone willing to function as the gatekeeper of their desires. The development of self-discipline begins with recognizing that your impulses, while natural and understandable, are not commands that must be obeyed immediately. The urge to defend yourself against criticism, to prove someone wrong in an argument, to pursue an attractive but risky opportunity, to avoid a difficult conversation, to indulge in something pleasant despite knowing it will have negative consequences. All these impulses are real, and you will feel them, but they do not require immediate action. The manipulator creates situations designed to trigger your impulses, knowing that if they can activate your desire or aversion strongly enough, you will act on it before engaging your capacity for strategic thought. They offer you the relationship, opportunity, or validation you desperately want, but only if you act now, only if you do not think too carefully, only if you override your own caution and judgment. But the person who has developed self-discipline can feel the impulse, acknowledge the desire, and still choose to wait, to investigate, to think through the long-term implications before committing. Machiavelli would recognize this as the virtue of prudence, the capacity to resist what feels good in the moment in service of what is actually good for your long-term interests. This trait requires that you develop the ability to tolerate frustration and delay, to accept that valuable things often require time and sustained effort rather than immediate acquisition. The manipulator exploits your impatience, your desire for quick solutions, easy answers, and instant results, offering you the appearance of progress while actually keeping you trapped in cycles that serve them. They present themselves as the fast track to what you want, the shortcut that allows you to bypass the slow, difficult work of genuine development. And if you lack the discipline to resist this appeal, you will find yourself perpetually dependent on them. But Machiavelli observed that lasting power was built through patient accumulation of genuine strength, rather than through dramatic but unsustainable gestures. And the same applies to personal development and genuine achievement. When you accept that real progress is incremental, that valuable skills and relationships are built over time through consistent effort, you become resistant to manipulators who promise you the world if you will just do this one thing, sign this one contract, make this one compromise. You recognize these offers for what they are: attempts to trade your long-term interests for their immediate benefit. The cultivation of self-discipline also involves developing what Machiavelli might call strategic self-denial. The practice of occasionally refusing yourself things you want, not because you cannot have them, but because the practice of refusal strengthens your capacity to resist manipulation through desire. If you always give yourself what you want the moment you want it, you never develop the muscle of restraint, and when a manipulator offers you something genuinely tempting, you will lack the strength to refuse, even when you should. But when you practice denying your impulses in low-stakes situations, when you deliberately delay purchases you can afford, conversations you want to have, or pleasures you could enjoy, you build the capacity to resist when the stakes are higher. This is not about becoming ascetic or joyless, but about ensuring that you remain the one who decides when and how you satisfy your desires, rather than being controlled by those desires or by anyone who can activate them. The person who cannot resist any temptation is a person who can be led anywhere by anyone willing to dangle the right bait. Moreover, self-discipline requires that you recognize and resist the manipulation of your competitive instincts and ego. Manipulators frequently trigger these by suggesting that others are getting ahead of you, that you are missing out on opportunities others are seizing, that your caution or restraint is actually weakness or cowardice. They know that if they can activate your desire to prove yourself, to compete, to demonstrate your worth or courage, you may take actions that are not actually in your interest, but that serve their purposes. But Machiavelli warned against allowing pride or competitive spirit to override strategic judgment, noting that leaders who could be provoked into foolish actions through challenges to their ego were easily manipulated by enemies who understood their psychology. You must develop the discipline to let others get ahead in races you never needed to run, to accept being called cautious or fearful when caution and healthy fear are actually appropriate, to resist the temptation to prove yourself to people whose opinions should not matter to you. This requires subordinating your ego to your strategic interests, which is one of the most difficult forms of self-discipline, but also one of the most powerful. The practice of self-discipline also involves creating systems and structures that support your long-term goals, rather than relying solely on willpower in the moment. Machiavelli understood that good institutions could constrain bad impulses more reliably than good intentions, and you must apply this same principle to your personal life. If you know that you are vulnerable to impulsive decisions when emotionally activated, you create rules for yourself about not making major commitments in emotional states, and you honor these rules even when your impulse is to break them. If you recognize that certain people or situations reliably trigger your worst impulses, you limit your exposure to these triggers rather than repeatedly testing your willpower against them. If you understand that immediate access to certain temptations weakens your resolve, you create barriers and delays that make impulsive action more difficult. This is not weakness, but rather wisdom. Recognizing that self-discipline is not infinite, and that intelligent design of your environment and commitments is more reliable than constant willpower exertion. The manipulator cannot exploit impulses you have made structurally difficult to act on. This fifth trait of disciplined self-mastery transforms you from someone who can be controlled through their appetites and impulses into someone who makes decisions based on strategic long-term thinking rather than immediate gratification. You recognize that the most effective manipulation often comes packaged as opportunity, that what you want right now may cost you what you want more in the future. That satisfaction delayed is often satisfaction amplified, while satisfaction seized, impulsively, is often satisfaction that evaporates quickly. In developing this capacity for self-discipline, combined with clear observation, emotional sovereignty, independent judgment, and strategic detachment, you create a defense that operates across all the domains where manipulation typically succeeds. You cannot be deceived, emotionally coerced, intellectually convinced your perceptions are wrong, threatened into compliance, or tempted into self-destructive choices. You have become someone who maintains agency over their own behavior, even in the presence of strong desires and clever enticements. And this self-mastery is one of the most powerful forms of protection against those who would use you for their own ends. The sixth trait that creates immunity to manipulation is what Machiavelli would identify as the cultivation of genuine self-sufficiency, the development of internal resources, capabilities, and sources of validation that reduce your dependence on external provision and approval. This trait is fundamental because manipulation ultimately derives its power from your needs, and the more you genuinely need from others, whether material resources, emotional validation, social status, or expert guidance, the more leverage they have to extract compliance in exchange for meeting those needs. Machiavelli observed that princes who depended on foreign support or mercenary armies were never truly secure, as those who provided the support could always withdraw it to enforce their will, while princes who built their power on domestic support and citizen soldiers maintained genuine autonomy. In your personal life, the same dynamic applies. Every genuine capability you lack, every resource you cannot provide for yourself, every source of worth that depends on others' opinions, creates a vulnerability that can be exploited, while every form of authentic self-sufficiency you develop reduces the points of leverage available to potential manipulators. The development of genuine self-sufficiency begins with an honest assessment of your current dependencies and a strategic plan to reduce those that make you vulnerable. This does not mean attempting to become completely independent of all human connection or assistance, which would be both impossible and undesirable, but rather identifying which dependencies create the most vulnerability and working to develop alternatives. If your entire sense of worth depends on one person's approval, you are extraordinarily vulnerable to manipulation by that person. But if you cultivate multiple sources of validation and ultimately learn to validate yourself based on your own values and standards, that leverage disappears. If your income depends entirely on one employer who knows you have no alternatives, you can be exploited through that dependency. But if you develop marketable skills and maintain awareness of other opportunities, you gain the capacity to leave exploitative situations. Machiavelli would recognize this as the strategic principle of not putting yourself in a position where you have no choice, where necessity forces you to accept whatever terms are offered, regardless of how unfavorable they might be. This trait requires that you invest in developing actual competencies and capabilities rather than just credentials or the appearance of competence. The manipulator can exploit your dependence on experts and authorities when you lack the knowledge to evaluate whether their advice serves your interests or theirs. But when you develop genuine understanding in domains that matter to your life, you can distinguish between legitimate expertise and authoritative-sounding nonsense. You need not become an expert in everything, but Machiavelli observed that leaders who understood at least the fundamentals of critical domains, whether military strategy, economics or law, were less easily deceived by advisors who might otherwise manipulate their ignorance. In your own life, learning the basics of finance makes you less vulnerable to predatory financial advisors. Understanding the fundamentals of psychology makes you better able to recognize manipulation tactics. Developing technological literacy makes you less dependent on those who might exploit your confusion. Each genuine capability you develop is a form of freedom from those who would control you through your ignorance or incompetence. The cultivation of self-sufficiency also involves developing emotional and psychological resources that allow you to meet your own needs for validation, meaning and purpose, rather than outsourcing these to others. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of self-sufficiency, because humans are inherently social and the need for connection and recognition is genuine and legitimate. But there is a crucial difference between wanting appreciation from others and needing it to feel worthwhile, between enjoying companionship and requiring it to feel complete. The manipulator exploits the latter, knowing that if you cannot feel good about yourself without their validation, they can control your behavior by providing or withdrawing that validation strategically. But when you develop the capacity to evaluate yourself according to your own standards, to recognize your own worth independent of others' opinions, to find meaning in your own values and purposes rather than those others assign to you, this particular form of manipulation loses its power. Machiavelli would understand this as the development of internal rather than external orientation, ensuring that your sense of self and worth comes from within, rather than being perpetually hostage to others' judgments. Moreover, genuine self-sufficiency requires that you develop the financial and material resources that provide options and alternatives. While it may seem crude to reduce the question of manipulation to economics, Machiavelli was unflinchingly realistic about the role of material resources in determining power dynamics, and the person who is financially desperate or materially dependent is vulnerable, regardless of how psychologically sophisticated they might be. The person who cannot afford to leave an abusive relationship, who cannot risk unemployment by reporting exploitation, who cannot turn down degrading work because they have no savings or alternatives, is in a fundamentally vulnerable position that manipulators can exploit. This does not mean that poverty is a moral failing or that financial success guarantees immunity to manipulation, but it does mean that developing financial stability, building emergency resources, living below your means to create options, and developing marketable skills are all forms of protection against manipulative relationships and situations. The capacity to walk away from any situation that does not serve you is dramatically enhanced when walking away does not mean destitution. The practice of self-sufficiency also involves regularly testing and validating your capabilities rather than assuming you have them. Machiavelli observed that armies that never fought became soft and unreliable when battle finally came, and the same applies to your own self-sufficiency. If you believe you are capable of surviving on your own but have never actually done so, your confidence may be misplaced, and a manipulator who senses this will call your bluff. But when you periodically practice self-reliance, when you deliberately do things yourself that you could outsource, when you test whether you actually can manage without certain supports you have become accustomed to, You develop both real capability and accurate confidence in that capability. This might mean taking a solo trip to verify you can navigate unfamiliar situations without help, managing your own finances rather than delegating entirely to an advisor, learning to be comfortable in your own company rather than constantly seeking social engagement, or developing skills you have always depended on others to provide. Each successful exercise of self-sufficiency both proves your capability and strengthens it, making the manipulator's suggestion that you cannot manage without them increasingly implausible. This sixth trait of genuine self-sufficiency transforms you from someone whose needs create vulnerabilities into someone who engages with others from a position of sufficiency rather than deficiency. You recognize that while interdependence and mutual support can be beautiful and valuable, dependence is dangerous because it gives others power over you that they may choose to exploit. When you can meet your own material needs, validate yourself according to your own standards, navigate challenges without constant expert guidance, and find meaning and purpose in your own values, you remove much of the leverage that manipulators use to control others. In developing this capacity for self-sufficiency, combined with clear observation, emotional sovereignty, independent judgment, strategic detachment, and self-discipline, you create a comprehensive defense against manipulation that addresses both psychological and practical vulnerabilities. You have become someone who interacts with the world from a position of authentic strength rather than hidden weakness. And this genuine capability makes the manipulator's promises and threats far less compelling than they would be to someone who genuinely needs what the manipulator claims to offer. The seventh and final trait that renders you immune to manipulation is what Machiavelli would recognize as the strategic cultivation of social awareness and the capacity to read human behavior with accuracy and depth, understanding not just what people say, but what they actually want, what truly motivates them, and what patterns their behavior reveals over time. This trait is essential because manipulation is fundamentally a social phenomenon, a game played between people where one attempts to influence the other's behavior for their own benefit. And if you cannot accurately read the game being played, you cannot defend yourself effectively, no matter how many other protective traits you possess. Machiavelli's work is fundamentally about understanding human nature as it actually operates, rather than as we wish it would operate. And this same unflinching social awareness is required if you are to navigate a world where many people will indeed attempt to use you for their own purposes, while claiming to have your best interests at heart. The development of social awareness begins with abandoning the comforting but dangerous assumption that people's stated motivations are their actual motivations, that the reasons they give for their behavior are the reasons they truly act. Machiavelli observed that human beings are extraordinarily skilled at rationalizing self-interested behavior as moral duty, presenting exploitation as generosity, and framing manipulation as care. And if you take these presentations at face value, you will be perpetually confused by the gap between what people claim and what they do. But when you learn to observe behavior over time and infer actual motivations from patterns of action rather than from stated intentions, a different and more accurate picture emerges. The person who consistently takes from you while claiming to give, who reliably positions themselves to benefit while framing their behavior as sacrifice, who always seems to have emergencies that require your resources but is never available when you need support. Such a person's behavior reveals their actual priorities, regardless of how altruistic their stated motivations might be. Social awareness means learning to trust the pattern over the explanation, the consistent behavior over the occasional exception. This trait requires that you develop the capacity to recognize common manipulation tactics and behavioral patterns, understanding that while every situation has unique elements, there are predictable strategies that manipulators employ across different contexts. Machiavelli's analysis of political behavior revealed recurring patterns because human nature itself is relatively consistent, and the person who understands these patterns can recognize manipulation even in novel situations. The pattern of love bombing followed by devaluation, the cycle of transgression followed by tearful apology followed by identical transgression, the strategic creation of urgency to prevent careful consideration, the isolation of targets from alternative sources of information or support, the incremental escalation of demands where each seems small but the cumulative effect is dramatic. These and many other manipulation patterns repeat across personal relationships, professional settings, and political contexts. When you understand these patterns, you can recognize them early rather than only in retrospect, and early recognition is the key to effective defense. The person who does not understand these patterns must learn about each manipulator through painful direct experience, while the person who has studied manipulation can recognize it on first encounter. The cultivation of social awareness also involves developing the capacity to recognize your own impact on others and how you might be perceived or categorized by potential manipulators. Machiavelli understood that different strategies were effective against different types of people, and manipulators similarly assess their targets to determine which approaches are most likely to work. If you appear naive and trusting, you will attract manipulators who exploit through deception. If you appear desperate for approval, you will attract those who manipulate through validation and withdrawal. If you appear wealthy or successful, you will attract those who manipulate through manufactured need or investment schemes. But when you understand how you might be perceived and what vulnerabilities this perception suggests, you can compensate by demonstrating traits that make manipulation more difficult, showing that you are not as naive, desperate, or easily impressed as you might initially appear. This is not about being inauthentic, but rather about recognizing that first impressions matter in determining who targets you and with what tactics, and that you can influence these impressions strategically. Moreover, social awareness requires that you develop the ability to distinguish between different types of relationships and interactions. Recognizing that not every friendly person is a friend, not every professional relationship should become personal, and not every personal relationship can bear the weight of complete trust. Machiavelli observed that princes needed to understand the difference between subjects, allies, and enemies, and that treating everyone the same was a form of dangerous naivety. In your own life, you must develop similar discernment, understanding that there are people you can be fully open with, people you can collaborate with professionally but should not confide in, people you can be friendly with but should not depend on, and people you should avoid entirely despite their pleasant surface presentation. The manipulator often exploits the failure to make these distinctions, positioning themselves as closer or more trustworthy than they have actually earned through demonstrated reliability. And if you fail to maintain appropriate boundaries based on what the relationship actually is rather than what you wish it were, you create vulnerability. Social awareness means calibrating your openness, trust, and investment to what has been earned through consistent behavior over time, rather than extending it based on claims, promises, or initial charm. The practice of social awareness also involves learning to recognize the specific vulnerabilities and psychological needs that manipulators in your life are targeting. Different manipulators will focus on different points of leverage based on what they observe about you. One might exploit your desire to be seen as competent by framing their requests as opportunities to demonstrate your abilities. Another might target your fear of conflict by creating situations where refusing them requires confrontation. A third might use your compassion by presenting themselves as perpetually in crisis and needing rescue. But when you understand which of your traits and needs are being targeted, you can respond more strategically, recognizing that the situation has been constructed to trigger a particular response from you and choosing a different response instead. Machiavelli's analysis of power always included understanding not just what others wanted, but why their tactics were designed as they were. And this same analytical approach allows you to see through the immediate situation to the underlying strategy being employed against you. This seventh trait of social awareness transforms you from someone who takes social interactions at face value into someone who reads the deeper currents of motivation, strategy, and pattern that underlie surface appearances. You recognize that in a world where many people are indeed attempting to advance their interests at others' expense, naive trust is not virtue, but vulnerability. That genuine goodness requires the capacity to recognize and defend against exploitation, rather than simply hoping everyone means well. When you combine this social awareness with clear observation of reality, emotional sovereignty, independent judgment, strategic detachment, self-discipline, and genuine self-sufficiency, you create a comprehensive immunity to manipulation that operates on every level where manipulation might be attempted. You cannot be deceived about what is happening because you observe clearly. You cannot be emotionally coerced because you maintain sovereignty over your responses. You cannot be convinced your perceptions are wrong because you trust your independent judgment. You cannot be threatened into compliance because you maintain strategic detachment. You cannot be tempted into self-destructive choices because you exercise self-discipline. You cannot be controlled through dependency because you have cultivated self-sufficiency. And you cannot be outmaneuvered socially because you understand the game being played. In developing these 7 traits, you have become the kind of person Machiavelli would recognize as truly formidable, someone who moves through the world with clear eyes, strategic thinking, and the capacity to protect their own interests while remaining ethical in their treatment of others. You have learned to see manipulation for what it is, and in seeing it clearly, you have rendered it powerless over you. The fortress you have built through these 7 traits is not a prison that isolates you from genuine human connection, but rather a stronghold from which you can engage with the world from a position of strength and clarity. What Machiavelli understood, and what you must now internalize, is that the capacity to recognize and resist manipulation does not make you cynical or cold. It makes you free. When you can see clearly what is happening around you, when you maintain sovereignty over your emotional responses, when you trust your own judgment, when you are not desperate for any particular outcome, when you control your impulses, when you can meet your own needs, and when you understand human behavior with nuance and depth, you gain the most precious freedom available to any human being, the freedom to choose your own path based on your own values rather than being herded down roads others have selected for their benefit. This is the freedom that manipulators fear most because it renders their entire arsenal ineffective. Their carefully constructed false realities collapse against your clear observation. Their emotional provocations fail to control your behavior. Their authoritative assertions cannot override your independent analysis. Their threats lose power against your detachment. Their temptations break against your discipline. Their offers of provision become unnecessary due to your self-sufficiency, and their social maneuvering is transparent to your awareness. Yet freedom from manipulation is only the beginning of what these traits offer, because the same capacities that protect you from being used also enable you to build something far more valuable: authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Genuine achievements earned through your own effort rather than manipulated outcomes. and a life directed by your own authentic purposes rather than scripts others have written for you. When you no longer need others to validate your worth, you can form connections based on genuine affinity rather than desperate attachment. When you can recognize manipulation, you can also recognize authenticity. And this ability to distinguish between those who genuinely care for you and those who merely find you useful becomes one of your most valuable capabilities. The relationships you maintain after developing these traits will be different from those you tolerated before. Fewer, perhaps, but infinitely more nourishing, because they will be chosen from clarity rather than need. Maintained through mutual benefit rather than one-sided sacrifice, and characterized by honesty rather than performance. Machiavelli's insights were not meant to make princes paranoid, but to make them effective, and these same insights do not make you suspicious of everyone, but rather discerning about who deserves your trust, your time, your resources, and your vulnerability. The cultivation of these 7 traits is not a destination you reach, but rather a practice you maintain, because the world continues to present new situations, new relationships, and new potential manipulators whose tactics may be more sophisticated than those you have previously encountered. But each time you successfully recognize and resist manipulation, each time you maintain your sovereignty in the face of pressure to surrender it, each time you choose your own path, despite social pressure or emotional coercion, you strengthen these traits further and make them more automatic, more reliable, more integral to who you are. What began as conscious, effortful practice eventually becomes second nature, a way of moving through the world that no longer requires constant vigilance because the patterns have become ingrained. You begin to notice manipulation attempts almost immediately, because your developed awareness recognizes the familiar patterns even in novel disguises. You find yourself naturally maintaining appropriate boundaries because your sense of self-worth no longer depends on others' approval. You discover that difficult decisions become clearer when you are neither desperate for particular outcomes nor controlled by immediate impulses. This transformation from conscious effort to integrated capability is the ultimate goal. Becoming someone for whom immunity to manipulation is not a set of techniques you employ, but simply who you are. What Machiavelli would want you to understand, above all, is that developing these traits is not about becoming manipulative yourself, though it inevitably means you will understand how manipulation works and could employ these tactics if you chose to. Rather, it is about becoming someone who does not need to manipulate because they have genuine strength, authentic capabilities, and clear understanding of their own interests and how to pursue them ethically. The difference between the manipulator and the person who cannot be manipulated is not that one understands power while the other does not, but rather that one uses their understanding to exploit others while the other uses it to protect themselves and build genuine value. You can understand every tactic in the manipulator's playbook and choose never to employ them. And this choice is not weakness, but rather the exercise of the very sovereignty these traits have given you. The manipulator operates from hidden weakness, needing to control others because they cannot generate genuine value or authentic connection, while you operate from actual strength, needing to control only yourself because you have developed the capabilities that make exploitation of others both unnecessary and beneath you. The question Machiavelli's work ultimately poses, and the question you must answer through your choices, is what kind of person you will be in a world where manipulation is common and power dynamics are real. Will you be someone who can be moved against your will, whose life is shaped more by others' agendas than your own purposes, who remains perpetually confused about why relationships and situations so often leave you depleted and exploited? Or will you become someone who sees clearly, chooses deliberately, maintain sovereignty over their own life, and build something genuine rather than merely surviving others' manipulations. These 7 traits offer you the path to the latter, but only if you commit to the difficult, ongoing work of developing them, only if you are willing to see uncomfortable truths about human nature and about yourself, only if you value freedom enough to pay its price in discipline and discernment. The choice, as it always has been and always will be, is yours alone to make. But understand that in choosing to remain vulnerable to manipulation, you are also choosing to surrender the most precious thing you possess, your own agency over the direction and meaning of your life. Machiavelli showed princes how to maintain their power not through naive hope or moral posturing, but through clear-eyed understanding and strategic action. And these same principles, applied with wisdom and integrity, can show you how to maintain sovereignty over your own existence in a world that will indeed try to take it from you if you let it. So take these traits, practice them, refine them, make them your own, not as weapons to harm others, but as armor to protect yourself and as tools to build the life you genuinely want, rather than the life others would impose upon you. If this resonates with you, if you recognize the truth in what Machiavelli observed about human nature and what these traits offer you as protection and empowerment, then demonstrate that recognition through action. Leave a comment sharing which trait you most need to develop or which insight struck you most powerfully. Subscribe to continue this exploration of how classical wisdom applies to modern challenges, how understanding power protects rather than corrupts, how you can navigate a manipulative world without becoming manipulative yourself. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone you care about who has been exploited too often, someone who deserves to understand that immunity to manipulation is possible and begins with the choice to see clearly and act sovereignly.